Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Wednesday, March the 29th, 2023. Continue to look at the story, not a parable, but the story of the Last Judgment, the Great Judgment, sometimes or even more commonly known as the sheep and the goats. Yesterday we talked about the fact that even though we tend to draw the immediate knee-jerk conclusion almost, comparing it in a sense to the parable of the wheat and the tares. So obviously the sheep are good and the goats are bad, and really that was not the case. In ancient times, that would have been a mixed herd in order to make the best use of the pasture land, which wasn't all nice green grass that the sheep tended towards, but it also had Scrabble type stuff and that the goats would go for. And the other thing is that when he talked about separating out the goats, that was often the case because the goats were reproduced more quickly and they didn't need as many male goats. And so actually the word for goat in the passage is the word for a young goat, a kid. And so that, really kind of puts a whole new twist on it. Well, today I want to talk a little bit more about what the parable means. And I want to continue to read beginning at verse 34 and through verse 40. Again, Jesus says when the Son of Man comes, he's going to gather all the nations and separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats, the sheep at the right and the goats at his left. Doesn't mention sheep or goats again. Verse 34, then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And of course, as you recall, the righteous say, well, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or, we were sick or in prison? And what does Jesus say? Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Ian Paul, again, who had the insights that I shared with you yesterday, also had something more to say here. He talks about how the most common interpretation of this passage is that the least of these who are named in the passage are just the poor in general. The sheep are probably the followers of Jesus who obey his teaching, who take care of the poor. And again, the goats are those who neglect Jesus's teaching. That's pretty much the general argument, the general agreement of what the passage means. But once again, he has some interesting insights. He talks about a scholar who points out the fact that Matthew never talks about Jesus's brothers or sisters as anyone except those who follow him. And in fact, in Matthew 12, we read, while he was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and brothers were standing outside wanting to speak with him. Someone told him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing here. But Jesus replied, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And so when he's talking about the least of those, is he talking about poor people in general, or is he talking about his followers? Furthermore, Jesus talks about the fact that to follow him may mean to or may result in them being homeless. And in Matthew 8:20, Jesus says, "Foxes have dens, the birds in the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." In other words, if you follow me, you're going to be like him, and that could involve being without a home, being a wandering stranger, relying on the charity and the provisions of others. So he says, putting this all together means the least of these is probably not referring to the poor in general, but Jesus's own followers. And those, therefore, on the king's right are the people who have welcomed his followers, and in doing so have welcomed Jesus. because there's also a passage in Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42, where Jesus says specifically, whoever welcomes you welcomes me. He's talking to his disciples. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever even gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you that none of these will lose their reward. So in other words, responding to the needs of his followers, his brothers and sisters, is the same thing as doing those things to Jesus. So in effect, how people receive the disciples and how they treat them is in effect how they treat Jesus. And it even kind of goes together with Paul's notion of believers as being the body of Christ, in the fact that Paul was probably shaped by the words that he heard on the Damascus Road, that when he was persecuting Jesus' followers, what does he hear? He hears Jesus say, "Why do you persecute me?" Persecuting Jesus' followers means to persecute Jesus. Giving food and water and shelter and visiting and all those things to Jesus' followers is the same thing as doing it to him. And so his conclusion is that the division here is not between those who care for the poor and those who don't. And he points out there's plenty of other passages in the Bible that argue that or make that point. But here, it's more about those who care for the followers of Jesus or don't. And in doing so, in doing it or not doing it, they're revealing exactly how they, their attitude and how they feel about the King himself, about how they feel about Jesus himself. And it's interesting because I think I mentioned in my sermon on Sunday, this is the last story illustration that he gives, because boom, everything just begins to steamroll after this, and you run into the rest of Holy Week and Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and the rest of the betrayal and everything else. And in that context, it kind of makes sense that Jesus is talking about his followers and those who are willing to stake their lives on him, and how they are received is, in truth, how people actually receive him. Well, we'll stop there. A little bit longer than I mean to, but very interesting passage. To have a little bit more to say about it in the next couple of days as well. Until then, take care. Hope to see you. Bye-bye.